Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell here with one of my most ambitious projects to date. With the new Godzilla Kong movie in theaters now, I had this crazy idea to go back and watch every movie featuring Godzilla and or King Kong and rank them all for the channel. Now, I know that there are a lot of people out there who have been fans of these movies for decades. I'm not one of those people. It's not that I dislike them, but most of these movies were first-time watches for me. So I'm sure in this ranking that there's going to be a lot of movies that are people's favorites that are low on my list and a lot of movies that people hate that are high on my list. I'm not here to ruffle any feathers or to tell anybody that they're wrong. This is a fresh eyes perspective on the Godzilla and Kong movies. Now, a few ground rules before we get started as far as eligibility. I'm ranking movies only, so none of the TV series will be included in these rankings. I'm also only including theatrical releases and official Toho films in the case of Godzilla, so none of the direct-to-video movies. Kong had a few animated that were direct-to-video. Also, I didn't do the expanded Showa-era Toho universe, which included the Mothra solo film, the Rodan solo film, only because I had to draw the line somewhere, and I wanted to make sure that the video got out. So in total, I'll be talking about and ranking 45 separate movies, all of which feature Godzilla, Kong, or both. And in addition to ranking them and telling you my thoughts on each of them, I'm also going to give you some stats as we go, including the destruction level of every movie on a scale from 1 to 10, as well as a running tally of Godzilla's win-loss record across his entire career. So without further ado, let's kick off this countdown. I basically have the movies subdivided into 3 categories. There are movies that I just didn't think were very good. There are movies that I think are good Godzilla or Kong movies that maybe don't necessarily stand on their own, some of them do, but are good in context of what they are. And then there's a group at the top that I think are just solid movies, whether you look at them as Godzilla movies or not. And let's start, unfortunately, at that bottom tier with my lowest ranked film. It comes in at number 45. It's a Godzilla film from the Showa era, the first era of Godzilla movies. And it's called All Monsters Attack. It is the 10th Godzilla movie and a direct follow-up to another film that is much higher on this list. And it gets the lowest spot in the rankings because it's not even really a Godzilla movie. It's about a young boy who's being bullied, who has dreams about going to Monster Island where Godzilla lives and hanging out with Minilla, who's Godzilla's son. The only Godzilla action we really see comes in the form of reused sequences from earlier films. Yes, that's right. There is a Godzilla movie that's basically the equivalent of a clip show. Minilla or Godzilla or Baby Godzilla or whatever you call him is a particularly useless character in the Godzilla mythology and continues to be so in this movie. He's dealing with his own bully called Gabara, who gets dispatched in the movie and also acts as sort of a spirit guide to this kid who not only deals with bullies, but also gets himself into a Home Alone type situation with a couple of robbers. In the end, the kid does triumph over his bullies, and by triumph, I mean he stands up to them and then immediately befriends them and joins them in bullying this poor working class guy who's just trying to paint a sign. That's a great lesson for you kids. If you can't beat them, join them, and then start trying to beat other people. All Monsters Attack is just a bad movie, I think, and skippable in every way. Sorry if it's one of your favorites. Godzilla does get his first W by taking down the bully Gabara, even though it's an imagined battle. I'm still going to count it. I am giving the movie, though, a destruction level of 0 out of 10, considering that Godzilla doesn't even really exist in All Monsters Attack. If you thought that the poorly made, rushed into production cash grab sequel was a product of modern day Hollywood, well, think again, because the movie that I have on my list at number 44 is called Son of Kong, which came out 9 months after the original King Kong hit theaters in the same year, with a few returning cast members, but not King Kong, who, as you may recall, ended the original film very quite dead. On the run from indictments after the initial Kong incident, director Carl Denham flees New York and heads back to Kong's Island along with a motley crew that includes a circus owner's daughter. Just don't ask.
I wish I'd left him on his island. Old Kong. I'm sure paying for what I did to you.
They land on the island about half an hour before the movie's over, and they find Kong's son, Baby Kong, who's almost as useless as Godzilla's son. But if you're tempted to watch this just as a follow-up to the original King Kong, don't bother doing that either, because at best it replicates a few beats from the original with a slightly comedic edge. The destruction level in this movie is basically zero. Kong's island is hit by a storm, but the baby monkey does no actual damage himself, so I'm going with 0 out of 10.
Believe it or not, there's a little Kong. What? A little... How little?
The movie on my list at number 43 is one of the most famous movies featuring either one of these characters, but also one of the most disappointing. As a matter of fact, it taught a 15-year-old me how crushingly disappointed Hollywood can make you if you invest your hopes and dreams too much into the summer's big movie. I'm talking, of course, about Roland Emmerich's disastrous 1998 Godzilla.
Godzilla.
It's Gojira, you moron!
A clip show is the only thing that kept this film from coming in last in my ranking of Godzilla movies. Toho stopped making Godzilla movies in order to give this new Godzilla universe in America room to thrive, and then immediately started the machine up again when it was evident just how much of a terrible film this was going to be. Everything is wrong with this movie, from the terrible casting to CGI effects that I think weren't even that good back then, to a truly misguided redesign of Godzilla into a dumb-looking mutated iguana. Somehow the guy in the suit looks less dated now, today, than this thing. Godzilla movies at this point have been operating by a fairly basic formula for the nearly 40 plus years that they've been around, and so they decided in bringing it to America to completely tinker with that formula with, again, disastrous results, adding a fourth act to the movie that happens before the third act even happens, sidelining Godzilla for a seemingly endless sequence when the movie turns into Jurassic Park and the characters run from hatched baby Godzillas. Every time you think this movie is over, it just keeps going, but does eventually end with Godzilla wrapped up in the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge and killed by missiles. It's a bad movie made by filmmakers so petty that they included caricatures of Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, who they were angry at for panning their last movie, and they didn't even have the guts to stomp them to death.
I fully expected that to happen, and I think the audience is waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, maybe they should have included that.
The only place Godzilla 98 gets high marks is in its destruction. Manhattan gets wrecked spectacularly, mostly by the US military, so I'm giving it a destruction rating of 8 out of 10. Godzilla's defeat at the hands of the US military, however, brings his combat record to 1-1.
That's a lot of fish.
Son of movies don't fare very well on this countdown. We just had Son of Kong, and at number 42, I'm including another Showa-era film called Son of Godzilla. You could make the argument that this is the point where the franchise commits to Godzilla as the unquestioned star after multiple other films tried to launch other kaiju into the mainstream. And what better way to endear Godzilla to the audience than by giving him a baby? Aww. In Son of Godzilla, a science team researching how to control the weather finds that they share their island with other monsters, including giant praying mantises and a spider called Kumonga. When a baby Godzilla hatches, his daddy emerges from the sea to protect the child, which I guess is good from a parenting standpoint, but from a natural selection/evolution standpoint, this kid would have been eaten almost immediately. I mean, he would have been mantis or spider food within 5 minutes if Godzilla hadn't intervened. Obviously, I'm no fan of Minilla, as Godzilla's son would later be known. His only real role in this movie and many others is to annoy Godzilla, then get in trouble and require rescuing. It also doesn't help that he literally sounds like an ass in the movie. One thing I do like about the film, though, is Kumonga, the giant spider, a pretty solid villain, a great practical puppet that also seems menacing, though out of context, his attempt at subduing baby Godzilla with webbing looks really bad if you just see baby Godzilla's side of it. Son of Godzilla does mark a transition point for Godzilla from atomic metaphor to campy pop culture icon. I don't mind a bit of cheese and a bit of camp. There's a lot of movies that have that are higher up on the list, but I don't think that they are successful in this film. In the end, Godzilla decides not to abandon his boy, like Daniel Plainview, and the two end up hibernating in the snow after scientists cause the island to deep freeze in an ending that feels to me like the kaiju equivalent of The Shining. Destruction overall is low given the movie's island setting with just a scientist base camp wrecked, so I'm giving it a 1 out of 10 for Carnage. Godzilla does get back above 500 though by defeating Kumanga to bring his record to 2-1.
Just what is this spider?
It's a giant spider.
At number 41 on my list is a movie that was released on a very momentous occasion for Godzilla, the 50th anniversary of the first movie's premiere. It's from what is called the Millennium Era of Godzilla films, and it's called Godzilla Final Wars, the last movie of this so-called Millennium Era. From what I can gather, there are some people that really enjoy Final Wars because the monster fighting truly is nonstop. It brings back nearly every famous monster face from 50 years of Godzilla history, but for me, it's not always quality over quantity. You definitely do have the quantity in this film, but I think that the quality is severely lacking. Final Wars takes place in a world where Godzilla has been buried by humanity in the South Pole, only for a group of aliens to unleash all the monsters in a bid to take over the Earth. This is a recurring theme. Also Unleashed is perhaps the most early 2000s movie of all time. It really does check all the boxes, from rip-off Matrix fights to atrociously bad early CGI to a fight between Godzilla and the 1998 Hollywood version, which they call Zilla, set to a Sum 41 song. There's also a side story about mutants that are also humans that are controlled by the aliens. For a movie that is supposed to be celebrating Godzilla's 50th anniversary, there's actually way more human stuff in it than you would anticipate, especially given the presence of so many other monsters. Of course, there's always human stuff in Godzilla movies, but this one-off alien invasion / mutant hybrid story really overdoes it. Still, the movie does have an extended kaiju climax featuring a showdown between Godzilla and his biggest rival, King Ghidorah, ending with Godzilla literally blasting him into space, which is pretty cool. Though I do have to deduct cool points because the end of Godzilla's beef with humans is via Deus Ex Manila, who comes in and basically just tells his dad to cut it out. There's definitely a so bad it's good quality happening here, and listen, if you just want to have a few cocktails and throw something on to laugh at, then Godzilla Final Wars is probably the movie for you. But as a Godzilla movie, I think it's a pretty tough watch despite the presence of so many monsters. However, the amount of monsters does allow Godzilla to run up the score on his win-loss record, as the king of all monsters records personal victories over Gigan, Zilla, Kumanga, a giant mantis, Rodan, Anguirus, King Caesar, Hedorah, Iberi, and Ghidorah to rack up 10 wins and run his overall record to 12-1. This is easily his best one-movie record. The destruction is also off the charts. There are lots of Godzilla movies that reference worldwide destruction that we don't see, but here we get to see the scope and scale of what's destroyed, so I have to give Final Wars a 10 out of 10 when it comes to Carnage, which is the only 10 out of 10 that I'm willing to give this movie.
What are they coming here for? They're coming to wake up Godzilla.
Up next are 3 movies, actually, that I'm presenting as a block because they really tell one story and not particularly well. I mentioned earlier that theatrical releases would be the only ones eligible, along with official Toho films. This is the one exception to that theatrical release policy because these are considered official Godzilla Toho productions. It is a trilogy of anime films that were released straight to Netflix, and while impressive in scope, I really think they should have been condensed into one movie that, if you combine all 3 movies into one, might have actually been a little interesting. The anime films take place in a future where mankind has abandoned Earth after Godzilla and other monsters have attacked and ruined it. But after failing to find a new home, the humans return to Earth after 20 years have passed, though due to the physics of space travel, 20,000 years have passed on Earth. And in this future, all creatures have evolved to serve Godzilla, who is now a massive, seemingly unkillable behemoth. It's an interesting premise, but it's extended over 3 long, dour, talky, boring movies that hammer the same points over and over and have repetitive action sequences that really could have been cut and combined together. The middle movie, City on the Edge of Battle, is easily the best as the humans find that the nanometal in Mechagodzilla has continued to evolve and become Mechagodzilla City, but even that concept is largely wasted, while Mothra is teased out across 3 films but never paid off. Even a cool concept for King Ghidorah is weighed down by an overly dramatic, religious-themed finale that takes center stage in place of the kaiju action. Godzilla doesn't really do much more than just stand there in all three movies. There are some interesting ideas at the core of these three movies, but when it comes to rewatchability, which was a key factor when I was deciding where to place each film, this ranks very, very low. I would not be excited about watching any of these three movies again. I think it's really just a missed opportunity. Godzilla does pick up a W over King Ghidorah to run his record up to 13-1. Despite having three movies though, on-screen carnage is relatively low, flashbacks don't count, with some ships and Mechagodzilla City taking the most damage. Overall, the anime trilogy gets a combined score, I suppose appropriately, of 3 out of 10. Next up is a King Kong solo movie that was actually made in Japan by Toho and from the director of the first Godzilla movies, along with many more, Ishiro Honda. The movie's called King Kong Escapes, and Ishiro Honda worked for years to get this movie made. I think this makes him the only director to make a solo Godzilla movie, a solo King Kong movie, and a movie featuring both of them. Toho produced this movie along with Rankin and Bass, the American production company that's perhaps best known for their stop-motion animation specials like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and the American influence is immediately evident with the addition of an American protagonist to entice, I guess, people in the US to go see the movie in theaters.
Well, I'm out of uniform, but I'm Commander Carl Nelson, captain of the UN Submarine Explorer.
Ooh.
In this campy adventure, a scientist named Doctor Who, no relation, creates a robot King Kong in order to obtain the rare mineral X, which is deep down in the Earth's core. But when this robot fails, Doctor Who goes for the real thing and uses mind control to get Kong to dig for him. Of course, things eventually end in a showdown between Kong and Robo-Kong. This movie has a very 1960s vibe. It was obviously very heavily influenced by the early James Bond films, and it's really a throwback to a time when two US sailors could just stand on top of a nuclear submarine and blast a couple cigs together. Kong does all the King Kong things like fight a dinosaur and fall in love with a lady. There's even a scene featuring a dying native who obviously served as the inspiration for Marion Cotillard's death scene in The Dark Knight Rises.
It's done.
King Kong Escapes is heavy on the camp, but a letdown in a lot of other ways, including an underwhelming final showdown. While Tokyo still gets hit, it's somewhat minor, rating just a 2 out of 10 on the destruction meter.
It must be my old friend, that international Judas, Doctor Who.
Well, we go from one disappointing King Kong sequel to another one, which came out 19 years later in 1986. It's called King Kong Lives, the decade-late sequel to 1976's King Kong. Despite Kong's very apparent on-screen death in 1976's King Kong, it turns out that scientists were able to revive him and have kept him in a coma for 10 years until an artificial heart could be built for him. And honestly, I would rather watch an entire movie about how you keep an ape as big as King Kong alive and in a coma for 10 years. On the plus side, if you ever wanted to see Linda Hamilton performing open heart surgery on an ape with comically large surgical instruments, well, this is the movie for you. Literally, I think the only movie for you. She's such a great surgeon that even after the operation, Kong shows absolutely no signs that he just had his chest cracked open, his heart yanked out, and replaced with a machine heart. King Kong Lives also introduces a mate for Kong, which drives him to break out of captivity, free Queen Kong, and run for the hills pursued by the army. And in what seems like a span of only a couple of days, the Kongs are able to conceive a child and have Queen Kong give birth to that child just as King Kong dies. Again. Honestly, the masochist in me wishes that they'd kept making these King Kong movies and inventing new ways to resurrect Kong every movie, like they did with Jason Voorhees, because by the third or fourth one, I think we would have been in some pretty uncharted territory. If King Kong Escapes is classic 60s cheese, this is classic 80s cheese, with Kong getting into all kind of hijinks, including a Porky-style voyeur session that leaves some poor high school kid with blue balls, and a hilarious encounter with a group of outmatched hunters. Wait, did I say hilarious? Because what I meant to say was horrifying. The movie's also dated in other ways. I mean, come on, kid. What are you doing? I have so many notes. While the stuff done at scale, like the surgery scene, is impressive, most of King Kong Lives is really corny and also fake looking. The suit is bad. King Kong Lives' damage is also limited mostly to small buildings and vehicles, so it doesn't even impress on a carnage level, getting a destruction rating of just 3 out of 10.
Oh no! My dad's gonna kill me!
So that's bad news for King Kong, but the good news for us is that it's the last movie that I would actually categorize in the bad category. From here on out, we're now going to move to movies that I think are good Godzilla or good Kong movies that, again, in the context of what we're talking about, are able to be at least passable, moving up to solid entries in this particular genre. At number 35, I've ranked the second ever Godzilla movie, which is called Godzilla Raids Again, released 1 year after the original. Godzilla Raids Again introduces one of the most famous and often used Godzilla enemies/allies, Anguirus, a spiky-backed mutated dinosaur. And you know what? I like Anguirus. I find him somewhat formidable, but also pathetic, but in a relatable kind of way. I don't know. He's like the everyman of the Godzilla kaiju collection. Godzilla's tussle with Anguirus, though, actually happens in the middle of the movie when he picks up a win against his new enemy by killing him and then burning the body for good measure. The second half of the movie is more about the humans and involves a pilot and a love story and disruption of fishing lanes. I think it actually slows down considerably after that first half, which drags the movie down and also dragged the movie down this list. Ultimately, humanity wins by pulling a Top Gun Maverick maneuver and bombing a glacier until Godzilla is buried in ice and snow. That doesn't keep him from picking up the W over Anguirus, running his record to 14-1. Osaka takes a pretty big hit in this movie as well, giving it a destruction rating of 5 out of 10. Ultimately, I think that this is an okay Godzilla movie that's perhaps better known for introducing one of its most enduring characters. At number 34 is actually the next film in the franchise. After Godzilla lay dormant for 7 years, he was resurrected by original director Ishiro Honda for an epic crossover event. It's 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, the first color film in the franchise. I do want to note that I'm basing my review here on the Japanese version of this movie. There's the Japanese release and then the American release, and the Japanese version is actually really hard to find. Even the Criterion collection in that box set right there, actually, of the Showa era films only includes the American version, but I think that there are some very key differences between the two versions that should make you seek out that Japanese version if you can, and it is available on some archive sites on the internet. First of all, the American version cuts in a bunch of boring talking heads to spoon feed the movie to us every 10 minutes or so, which is a real drag.
Roughly, this particular form of reptile existed somewhere between 97 and 125 million years ago.
It's also heavily recut and resequenced, but the biggest alteration is pretty egregious because in the Japanese version, when Godzilla first breaks free from the glacier, we get our first ever use of the Godzilla fanfare, aka that music that plays every time Godzilla shows up now in a Godzilla movie.
It's Godzilla!
While Akira Ifukube's Godzilla theme did make its first appearance in 1954's original, this fanfare, the attack music, didn't appear until King Kong vs. Godzilla, but only if you watch the Japanese version. The American version replaces the music and cuts the theme song altogether, basically omitting the first use of one of the most enduring symbols of Godzilla.
Godzilla!
The world is stunned to discover that prehistoric creatures exist in the 20th century.
As for the movie itself, it's pretty cheesy, which is a running theme, especially in the Showa era. But what actually moves it a little bit up my list into this good category is the running theme that's happening parallel to Godzilla and Kong fighting, which I think is a pretty clever satire on the media and capitalism in Japan. Kong's entire reason for being brought to Japan is to boost the ratings for a show being sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. This marks another transition in the franchise, which begins as a sort of somber meditation on the atomic age, but now transitions into satire and commentary on Japanese culture itself. As the post-war economy boomed, Japan saw a rise in power and prominence, but also a rise in capitalism, as you would expect. And that's very much what this movie is commenting on. It's actually fascinating to watch what these movies are satirizing or commenting on evolve as the decades go, which is one reason why I was glad that I watched these movies as close as I could in chronological order. The Kong-Godzilla fight scenes are, yes, campy fun. This was the first time the let them fight solution to a kaiju infestation was given a trial run. The monsters also start getting athletic, with Kong executing a particularly strong sliding tackle on Godzilla. In the end, while both Godzilla and Kong take a tumble into the ocean, it's Kong who emerges from the water while Godzilla stays submerged. And by the Freddy versus Jason rules of monster fighting, that means that I'm giving the win to King Kong in this movie, which moves Godzilla's career record to 14-2, his first loss to another monster. Japan's major cities are largely spared in this film, but some landmarks like Atami Castle bite the dust, so I'm giving it an overall destruction rating of 4 out of 10.
And strangely enough, we wish him luck on his long, long journey home.
Coming in at number 33 on my list is another Showa-era film, and it's a movie that really sees the influence of 1950s American sci-fi on the Godzilla movies. It's called Invasion of Astro Monster, and it finds aliens from Planet X offering to give humanity the cure for cancer if they'll loan out Godzilla and Rodan to fight King Ghidorah, also known as Monster Zero if you're nasty, on Planet X. Godzilla's evolution into a sometimes comic character begins in earnest with this movie, perhaps best exemplified by the now iconic Godzilla victory dance that he does when he sends King Ghidorah flying into space. As would become a theme in Godzilla movies, the aliens from Planet X are actually trying to dupe humanity and conquer the Earth, this time seeking to colonize the Earth or use their newly captured monsters to destroy it through mind control. This betrayal prompts some vintage tough guy talk, really just grade A stuff from the English-speaking American astronaut protagonist.
If there's any chance of averting this war, you better tell me about it and tell me about it right now. Because if we don't find a solution to this thing, happiness in this world ain't gonna be worth a hill of beans, you hear?
Naturally, a small-time inventor's personal alarm device proves to be the key to undoing Planet X's mind control, and the aliens are defeated while the monsters go back to doing what they do best, which is fighting each other, with Rodan largely acting as Godzilla's ally. And just a year after Muhammad Ali won his first heavyweight title, it was very apparent that Godzilla was already taking notes from the greatest. In the end, King Ghidorah is the only monster left standing, with Godzilla and Rodan taking a tumble into the sea together. Given the previously stated Freddy vs. Jason rules, I'm obliged to give King Ghidorah the win, taking Godzilla's record to 14-3. The damage in this movie is limited in scope, so it gets a mere 5 out of 10 on the destruction scale, which is pretty low for a movie with King Ghidorah in it. Overall, Invasion of Astro Monster is short on the commentary we get from a lot of Godzilla films, and also somewhat short on the kaiju stuff, but the action that we do get is really good, strong Godzilla stuff, which puts it where it is on the list.
In defense of Earth, we're gonna fight to the last man, baby. Now where's your conscience, or have you turned that over to your computers too, huh?
At number 32 is a movie that came late in Godzilla's initial Showa era. It's called Godzilla vs. Megalon, and it comes at a time when Godzilla was already firmly entrenched in pop culture, and the movies were becoming more formulaic. The big change here is the introduction of an ally named Jet Jaguar, a robot that can blow itself up to kaiju size, and I'm just gonna say it, there is zero chance that the design for Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin wasn't based on Jet Jaguar. Sometimes I'll give artists some leeway, but there is a costume designer out there who spent a lot of time watching Godzilla movies growing up and took that inspiration to Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin suit. Humanity's threatened this time not by aliens, but by the residents of Seatopia, an underwater colony who have had it with humanity and their atomic testing, so they unleash onto the Earth Megalon, their protector, and Godzilla is called upon to be the hero, a transition that would happen more and more as the character became more popular. The movie's called Godzilla vs. Megalon, but it's really Godzilla and Jet Jaguar versus Megalon and Gigan, one of my favorite Godzilla opponents who has razor-sharp arms and a buzzsaw in his stomach. These two fierce monsters can only be defeated by the best/worst Godzilla move of all time. I am talking, of course, about the sliding tail kick. Honestly, I think this is the movie that truly defines why you have to judge some of these films on a scale all their own, because in a vacuum, this is a really cheesy film, but in the context of Godzilla, it's also very charming. It delivers a lot of what makes the Showa era films in particular entertaining and have made them fan favorites. It's squarely not to be taken seriously, but it's also not insulting to your intelligence. In defeating both Gigan and Megalon, Godzilla runs his record up to 16-3 with an assist from Jet Jaguar. On the destruction scale, Tokyo gets hit pretty hard in this movie, and an entire dam gets taken down. So I'm giving the movie a destruction score of 7 out of 10. At number 31 is the first movie on this countdown from Godzilla's Heisei era, which ran from 1984 to 1995. It's a 1994 film called Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, where a space monster approaches the Earth as dueling factions decide how to deal with the Godzilla problem. One government program wants to control him through telepathy with a kaiju cerebro device, while a rogue faction wants to kill him with a blood coagulant, a plan that would feature in a later and I think better Godzilla movie. This isn't just any space monster though, it's made from Godzilla cells that found their way into outer space and through a black hole to become Space Godzilla. And naturally, Space Godzilla's first move is to attack the weakest creature on the planet, Manila, who continues to be extremely useless. The real action happens in Fukuoka City, which Space Godzilla turns into a giant battery. There, Godzilla teams up with a human mecha called Moguera to cut the power to Space Godzilla, which consists mainly of absolutely demolishing everything in sight. This is one of the most destructive Godzilla final battles to date. What this final battle may lack in novelty, it makes up for in style with lots of flying crystals and sparks. Of course, Godzilla wins the day and defeats his nemesis so he can return home and supervise his characteristically incompetent son. This is a Godzilla movie that is just straight down the middle. It's a zone that we're going to be in for a little bit. It avoids some of the things that have taken down earlier films on this ranking, but also doesn't hit the high notes of some of the films that we'll talk about later. Godzilla's win ups his overall record to 17-3, while the absolute devastation in Fukuoka City, combined with some bonus Tokyo destruction, gets us to a destruction score of 8 out of 10.
The space monster has exactly the same G cells. Therefore, we named it Space Godzilla.
At number 30 is a movie called Godzilla 2000 Millennium, which was released in 1999. It's the first movie in Godzilla's Millennium era. That makes sense. The Millennium era is famous for wiping continuity in basically every film. So here we have a Japan that has only seen Godzilla once back in the 1954 original. His movements are being tracked by a civilian organization called the Godzilla Prediction Network. And this Godzilla is a spikier, leaner looking Godzilla design than a lot of the ones that we'd seen up to this point. Aliens are, of course, menacing the planet once again, searching for Godzilla's regenerative secrets with a plan to terraform the Earth. And since we're at the turn of the century, computer effects are now taking center stage more in these Godzilla movies. And again, somehow I think they've aged worse than the miniatures and back projection in the older movies. Maybe it's because there's a tangibility factor with models and sets and everything when they were working at scale, but suffice to say, this franchise has a long way to go from this movie to the visual effects Oscar that they just won with Godzilla -1. Eventually, of course, the aliens create their own kaiju to fight Godzilla, which feels more obligatory than anything. And as with a lot of the other movies in this tier, this is just kind of a meh movie. Godzilla does get the W for a record of 18-3, and Tokyo takes a beating, including the destruction of multiple large buildings, landing the movie a destruction score of 6 out of 10. At number 29 is the first attempt to remake the classic film King Kong. It's 1976's King Kong. Capitalism run amok is the theme of this reimagining, as Charles Grodin plays an oil executive looking to plunder Kong's island for its untapped oil wells.
I believe we're headed for the biggest oil strike ever.
When the wells turn out to be a bust, he brings Kong back instead to save face and turn a profit. Jessica Lange plays a shipwreck survivor who's brought on board the expedition. Her name in this movie is Dwan. D-W-A-N. Not Dawn. It wasn't a misprint. Dwan. It was the 70s. Jeff Bridges also co-stars as a stowaway paleontologist who thinks Kong should be studied, not exploited. And when watching a remake of a classic movie like King Kong, I think the main question that I ask myself is, what does this movie do better than the original? The big thing that this film had to offer at the time was what they thought were upgraded special effects. But I think with hindsight and time passing, that they look as dated as the effects in the original King Kong movie. So on that front, I think it's really a wash. Kong 76 is perhaps most notable for its finale, which was relocated from the Empire State Building to the then new World Trade Center, a set piece that's now really just become a sad memorial through the hindsight of history. Otherwise, this is just 1933's King Kong, but longer and with more blood. There are a few attempts at satire, but it's not enough to elevate this movie above the original, or I think even approaching the original, and it's not even the best remake of the 1933 original. Kong's never been a super destructive monster, so this version also doesn't rack up a whole lot of carnage, rating just a 3 out of 10 on overall destruction.
There is a girl out there who might be running for her life from some gigantic turned-on ape.
There's a national energy crisis which demands that we all rise above our private selfish interests.
At number 28 is another Showa-era film called Ebirah, Horror of the Deep. It features one of Godzilla's lesser-known enemies, but I think there's a lot of potential here that's perhaps untapped. Here we find a group of guys and a bank robber washing up on an island while trying to find a crew that was lost at sea. Naturally, it turns out that the island is Godzilla's hibernation zone, and the waters around it are guarded by a vicious crab-like monster called Ebirah. Godzilla does eventually wake up to take on Ebirah, but it proves to be an easy victory, with Godzilla eventually yanking off Ebirah's claws and taunting it with them. This is the ultimate power move, really. I mean, never let it be said that Godzilla sometimes isn't kind of a dick. Otherwise, it's pretty standard stuff. This was Ebirah's only solo appearance in a Godzilla film, although it would appear in other team-up movies later on down the line. Godzilla's victory moves him to 19-3 against all opponents. The island setting keeps the destruction in the movie pretty light, but the entire power plant exploding takes this score up to a 3 out of 10. Our next two spots are taken up by the two films that closed out the Showa era and that both also featured one of Godzilla's most iconic enemies. The first movie here is 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. Everything seems normal when Godzilla emerges once again, but his aggression gives way to the revelation that he's actually Mechagodzilla, a robot from space sent by aliens bent on world domination. Sound familiar? But these aliens are actually monkey men, so it's totally different from other alien plots. Poor Anguirus almost gets killed before the real Godzilla intervenes in fight scenes featuring some of the biggest explosions in the series yet, which look cool watching at home, but which must have been terrified for these poor dudes trapped in lizard suits on set. Godzilla also gets a new ally in this movie in King Caesar, an ancient guardian who can only be awakened through song. A very, very long song. Godzilla and Caesar do team up to take down Mechagodzilla. We also find out in this fight with his robot counterpart that Godzilla is a bit of a bleeder. I mean, I know he's a big guy, but I'm worried he might be a little hemophilic. Get that iron check, pal. Eventually, Godzilla uses his powers to become a magnet, because of course he does, and rips Mechagodzilla's head off, but this is only the first tussle between these two. Godzilla's win against Mechagodzilla alongside King Caesar brings his overall record to 20-3. The destruction in the movie is pretty pedestrian and rates just a 4 out of 10 on the destruction level, and honestly, this would probably be much higher up the list if it wasn't such a slog to get to that third act finale, because the end battle in this movie is pretty great. At number 26 is the final film in the Showa era, Terror of Mechagodzilla. Original director Ishiro Honda returned to direct this final Showa film, and you're not going to believe this, but aliens are still plotting to take over the world using Mechagodzilla and an ancient dinosaur called Titanosaurus brought up from the depths of the ocean, and this time, things are getting a little kinky.
ここで地球人を取り逃がすことは死罪に値する。
Mechagodzilla and Titanosaurus do a lot of damage to Tokyo before Godzilla can intervene in an epic showdown, though I can't say that Godzilla fully wins the day. While he does dispatch Titanosaurus, Mechagodzilla has him soundly beaten until the human controlling the robot kills herself in order to shut the machine down. So I can do no better than to call Godzilla's fight with his mecha counterpart a draw, bringing his combat record to 21-3 and 1. So we now have wins, losses, and draws. The destruction in this movie is real, with massive fireballs, lasers, and wind taking out big chunks of Tokyo. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 as Godzilla walks away into the sunset and the Showa era, Godzilla's 21-year-long first cinematic reign, officially comes to an end. We have so many more movies to talk about, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for this show, Mando. This episode's brought to you by Mando. It's hard to believe, but we're steaming towards summer movie season real fast, and that means temperatures are rising too. And if you're like me, summer is a sweaty, potentially smelly season. But this summer, I'll be using Mando. Mando whole body deodorant is helping men conquer their odor in a new way because it's formulated with mandelic acid, which gives Mando long-lasting 72-hour odor control that actually stops odor before it starts. I've been working out a little bit more lately, which means I'm pouring sweat, but I haven't had to worry about jumping into the shower the instant I'm done. It's nice to have that cool down time knowing that I won't be leaving behind an unpleasant smell. And I really like the way that Mando smells. I have a solid stick deodorant, a bar for the shower, and even some deodorant wipes that I can take on the go for any part of my body I think might need it. If you're new to Mando, their starter pack is perfect. You get a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. And I have a discount code to help you get hooked on my favorite smelling whole body deodorant. New customers get $5 off a starter pack with our exclusive code, which means that you're getting over 40% off your starter pack. Use code DAN at shopmando.com. That's SHOPMANDO.com using code DAN. Mando, it's time to smell better naked. Well, from the end of one era, we go to the beginning of another one. 1984's The Return of Godzilla, the beginning of the Heisei era. 9 years after the Showa era's end, the series was revived in 1984 for Godzilla's 30th anniversary. The movie's called The Return of Godzilla, but it's also known as Godzilla 1984 in Japan and Godzilla 1985 in the US, where it was released with additional material featuring Raymond Burr, just as was done with the original Godzilla film. This review, by the way, is for the Japanese version. It's actually kind of sad because the first 4 Heisei era films are pretty much unavailable right now for purchase, for streaming, for rental. They're basically unfindable except for some lower quality versions, again, that you can find on archive sites around the internet. I was lucky enough to find somebody who was selling versions of these films at a much higher quality that were salvaged from earlier physical media releases. And I don't usually endorse going through these sort of back channels in order to find movies, but also when a studio or when an entity makes it impossible to find these movies, sometimes you do have to go to alternative sources in order to find them. And I was glad that I could actually find them at pretty good quality because they're not bad movies. Honestly, even though I now own the movies on a physical disc, I would happily rebuy the collection if they were remastered or repackaged like Criterion did with the Showa era. I'd love to see all of these films grouped together because this is an era of Godzilla that I think is in danger of becoming lost simply because of unavailability. In this new era, all of Godzilla's appearances post-1954 have been wiped from continuity as Japan stands on guard 3 decades after Godzilla's original attack. Things go into crisis mode when Godzilla attacks the submarine of Soviet commander Ron Burgundy, forcing Japan to acknowledge his awakening in order to avoid an international nuclear war. There are no other kaiju in this movie, just a fight between Godzilla and humanity, who have invented a new plane called the Super X to fight Godzilla. And as Godzilla sucks up power from nuclear reactors, we also get the first glimpse of his dorsal spikes charging up, something we'd see in a lot of other movies. Previously, they just glowed when he'd use his atomic breath. There is talk of using nuclear weapons and some ruminations on Japan's history with atomic bombs, but it's not as message heavy as a lot of other Godzilla films. Eventually, Godzilla is lured lured to an active volcano where he sinks into a fiery prison. Overall, this is pretty standard Godzilla stuff. It's not bad, but it's not great either. And I think it's even more disappointing when you look at the fact that this was the 30th anniversary of Godzilla and it had been almost a decade before a Godzilla movie had even been in theaters. The destruction level is pretty tame, with Godzilla wrecking his usual military vehicles, power plants, and Tokyo buildings. I'll give it a 5 out of 10 on the destruction score. Godzilla's defeat at the hands of humanity also runs his record to 21, 4, and 1.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
At number 24 is a movie that has a villain that is much more memorable than the movie itself. It's 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan, the first appearance of the saw blade-stomached, particularly vicious and, in my opinion, underused Gigan, who's brought to Earth by, surprise, aliens bent on taking over the planet. These aliens are from Nebula M, and they're actually cockroaches who take the place of dead people. The alien plot revolves around an undercover operation centered in a kids' theme park that features a life-size tower of Godzilla, because who better to attract the kids than a monster who's killed literally thousands, if not millions of people. The James Bond influence is very heavy in this film, complete with the evil guy turns around in a big chair moment. The plan is to summon Gigan and King Ghidorah from space to wipe out humanity, but Godzilla and Anguirus get wise to the plan and show up to stop them. We even get a glimpse at how these two friends communicate with each other via animated kaiju speech bubbles. As goofy as this movie is, it also goes hard on the monster battles, with multiple scenes of Godzilla getting cut and injured and blood flying everywhere. Godzilla's wins against Ghidorah and Gigan give him 2 Ws with the assistance of Anguirus, upping his record to 23, 4, and 1. Tokyo takes a hard hit with all the monsters invading and stomping around, leading to one of the most destructive movies we've seen yet, and a destruction level score of 8 out of 10. At number 23, we have a sequel to an earlier Godzilla movie that was released technically 19 years later, but isn't actually connected to the first film anyway. It's the Heisei-era film Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, though it doesn't share any plot threads in common with its predecessor. An anti-Godzilla task force called the Counter-G Bureau is tasked with building a machine to fight Godzilla using scavenged parts from a cyborg version of King Ghidorah. We'll talk more about that later. This team is led by the G-Force, which in this case is not a team of hyper-intelligent guinea pigs. Because every era has to have some version of this character for some reason, a baby Godzilla hatches, yay, from an egg that scientists recover from an island. It turns out that Rodan unintentionally served as the baby's protector and is thanked for his trouble by getting wrecked by Godzilla. Summoned by his offspring, Godzilla stomps his way through Japan to find his baby and comes up against Mechagodzilla, and the fights between these two are pretty epic, including a Harry Potter-style matchup of atomic breath versus robot breath. There is a reason why this is the highest-ranked Mechagodzilla film on the list so far. Rodan tries to stir up some trouble, but is defeated by Mechagodzilla, setting up the epic final fight, including a Power Rangers-style beat where Mechagodzilla joins with humans to become a Super Mechagodzilla. Godzilla actually almost dies in this movie due to the discovery of his vulnerable second brain in his abdomen, but Rodan flies in with the assist, revives his sworn enemy, and fuels him to a win. This is still a pretty silly film, especially with all the stuff involving psychic powers. Psychics would actually be a running plot point in the Heisei era, but it also has some really great stuff, a great final fight, and some good stuff with Rodan as well. Godzilla picks up 2 Ws in this movie over Rodan and Mechagodzilla, pushing him to 25, 4, and 1. Kyoto, Sendai, and Tokyo all take localized damage, giving this movie a destruction rating of 6 out of 10.
You know, I pity your future husband. He's gonna be a real handful.
At number 22, we have the second film in the Millennium era. It's called Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, the G Annihilation Strategy, and it takes place in a Japan that abolished all nuclear energy following the first Godzilla's attack. After Godzilla starts destroying clean energy as well, a task force called the G-Graspers, that's an interesting name, is established in 2001 to eliminate Godzilla for good. Over the decades, humanity's come up with lots of ways to try and kill Godzilla, but this one is legitimately one of my favorites. In this movie, they develop a miniature black hole gun that will eliminate Godzilla by pulling him into a localized singularity. Listen, in a franchise like this, why not go big? Although I think that there was something lost in translation in the English dub of the movie because they refer to a very different type of black hole.
Why do you need to be fit when you're gonna make Godzilla disappear up his own butthole, huh?
Unfortunately, the black hole machine opens a gateway that allows a mutant dragonfly to lay an egg that hatches and sprouts out a swarm of other mutant dragonflies. I hate when that happens. These dragonflies then feed on Godzilla's energy to birth Megaguirus, a big old Godzilla-hating bug. There are some real horror vibes in this movie, especially when the mutated insects start hunting regular people in the city. And while I'm not a fan of the Godzilla design in this film, I do like the out there black hole premise, the execution of Megaguirus, and the final fight. This is also a very damage-heavy movie, with Osaka taking a hit, Shibuya being completely flooded, and Tokyo taking the brunt of the final battle, in addition to black hole gun damage. I'm giving Godzilla vs. Megaguirus an 8 out of 10 on the destruction scale, as Godzilla wins and runs his record up to 26, 4, and 1. At number 21 is the next film in the Millennium series, the third Millennium film overall, and it brings in a lot of familiar faces as well as the longest title of all the Godzilla movies. Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack was released in 2001, bringing the classic Godzilla monsters into the 21st century. While the continuity for Japan's Godzilla was once again wiped clean in the movie, I do have to give it points for pettiness because it immediately makes clear that the Godzilla that showed up in America was no Godzilla of Japan's.
Another giant monster attacked the east of America at New York City.
The New York attack was Godzilla, right? That's what all the American experts claim, but our guys here have doubts.
They do something a little radical with Godzilla's design in the movie, giving him all white eyes and making him a little bit more mindless. Some people love it, some people don't. I'm not a big fan. I think it looks kind of cheap, but I do have to respect the brutality that they give Godzilla as he stomps innocent people to death in their bathrooms, even leading a helpless lady in a hospital to believe that she's been spared, only to destroy the hospital with his tail anyway. Godzilla takes on a succession of monsters, starting with an easy win versus the classic monster Baragon. And one thing I do like about this movie is that they don't necessarily feel beholden to the classic continuity of the other monsters in Godzilla's universe. For example, Mothra isn't Godzilla's friend, but an enemy fighting him, and King Ghidorah also isn't a threat to humanity, but one of its protectors. The best part of the movie is easily the third act, which features some of the biggest and best fighting in the entire series. Eventually, Godzilla is able to dispatch all three of his monster opponents, but is defeated by the humans after his atomic breath escapes from a hole that's been drilled into his body. Godzilla's 3 wins and 1 loss run him to a record of 29, 5, and 1. The damage is mainly localized to Tokyo, but the scale of that damage is huge, so it gets a rating of 7 out of 10, an appropriate number for a movie with some of the most widespread monster fighting we've seen so far.
Godzilla! It's Godzilla!
At number 20 is a movie that may seem familiar because it is the most recent film in the Godzilla Kong universe. It is this year's Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. I don't want to give away too much spoiler-wise about the latest movie, but I will say that it is much more of a good Godzilla Kong film than it is a good movie. It's elevated by some pretty spectacular monster fight sequences, but let down by a somewhat lackluster human story and some pretty forgettable villains. I actually thought that there was one character that showed up that was going to be Anguirus, and I got excited, but it turned out to just be a new, completely unaffiliated character. I did a full review here of Godzilla Kong: The New Empire on the channel if you want to check that out. Without giving away the particulars, I can say that Godzilla racks up 3 victories, both solo and alongside Kong, which moves him to 32, 5, and 1 all time. There's also a lot of destruction spread around the globe, including in Rome, France, and Rio de Janeiro. That brings the destruction score up to a 7 out of 10 for the latest Godzilla Kong adventure. At number 19 is the 5th Showa-era film and the movie that introduced us to perhaps the most iconic Godzilla villain of all time. It's called Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, the Joker to Godzilla's Batman. This also introduces Rodan to the Godzilla mythology, though Rodan himself first appeared in his own solo film back in 1956. Godzilla became so dominant that it's easy to forget that back in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that he would always be the featured monster in the Toho universe. They were building out lots of other solo films. It's just that public opinion and sentiment seemed to rally around Godzilla, and so he absorbed these other franchises. I've talked about the American influence on a lot of these Godzilla films from the 50s and 60s, but I also think that there is some demonstrable influence from these Godzilla films on current American filmmakers that goes beyond Jet Jaguar's resemblance to the Green Goblin. One of those influences is a cutaway that happens in this movie that immediately made me think of Wes Anderson.
しかし、一人だけ面白いこと言った人がいるんです。誰？宇宙円盤クラブの会長です。
そりゃあね、その人は次元の裂け目落ち込んで助かったんじゃないですか?
Given that Wes Anderson has often paid homage to Japanese style and Japanese culture, particularly in Isle of Dogs, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the Japanese cinematic language, particularly of Godzilla films, made its way into his vocabulary. This was the 5th Godzilla film, but the first to feature a monster team-up to take down another monster. This actually leads to a very funny scene where Mothra is trying to make peace between Godzilla and Rodan so that they can all work together, but Godzilla and Rodan just can't stop being petty and put aside their differences.
ゴジラもラドンもお互いにお前が謝れと言い合っています。
Once Mothra completes her conflict resolution, the big fight is on and the trio is able to run King Ghidorah out of town and celebrate together. While Godzilla gets into 2 big scuffles, his fight with Rodan goes down as a draw due to Mothra's interruption in order to take care of the bigger business at hand. However, he does get the assisted W against King Ghidorah, netting him a 33-5-2 overall record. King Ghidorah and his lightning are able to cause a lot of damage over a relatively small area, which averages out to a destruction score of 6 out of 10.
They're breakdance fighting.
At number 18 is a meetup between perhaps the 2 most beloved characters in Godzilla mythology. I'm talking, of course, about Godzilla and Mothra. It's 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla, which directly preceded the introduction to King Ghidorah. When a huge egg washes up in a typhoon, a corporation is quick to buy it, claim franchise rights, and plan a public display. As we often see in this era, Japan's booming economy made capitalism a target-rich environment for commentary and satire in the Godzilla films, in many ways replacing what they were saying about the atomic era in the early movies. In many ways, this is also the first combination of all the elements that you could put together to make a quote-unquote stereotypical film in the Showa era. The Godzilla suit has evolved to a more familiar form. Godzilla's attack music is now standard. The cast of supporting monsters is beginning to assemble, and it all ends in a big third-act fight. All of these things would define Godzilla movies for years to come, and in many ways still do. We also get the introduction of a recurring plot point, which is that if Mothra shows up, her days are numbered. She rarely is able to survive an encounter with Godzilla or any other monsters. And true to form, she dies here for the greater good, giving way to the new generation of Mothra larvae, who spend a very, very long time spraying Godzilla down with cocoon fluid, but once he's wrapped up, he rolls into the water and ceases menacing humanity for now. While Godzilla is able to notch a win against Mothra 1, who he defeats via atomic breath, he loses to Mothra's offspring for a split record that takes him to 34-6-2. The damage in the film is spread out across Japan, but also pretty heavy where it occurs, which lands this movie a destruction score of 5 out of 10.
あなたたちはモスラの人情でも持ってらっしゃるっておっしゃるんですか? こいつはいいや。
This ranking may upset some people, but I rewatched all of the movies in this series, even ones that I hadn't seen in a very long time, and after over a decade of having not seen the film, it actually had a lot more shortcomings than I remembered, and it's Peter Jackson's 2005 remake of King Kong, which had maybe the most potential to be even higher on this list, and at its best, it is the best version of the King Kong story. But the high points in King Kong, and there are lots of them, are weighed down by the fact that this movie is so damn long. I mean, I don't mind long movies. Peter Jackson himself made 3 great ones with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but he used all of that capital to make this movie the way that he wanted to, and there should have been somebody reining him in. The story goes back to the original film's roots as director Carl Denham recruits a ragtag crew to venture to Skull Island and capture the greatest film ever made. Jack Black as Carl Denham is a great reminder that he walked so that Josh Gad could, well, also walk. Also, and I had to go back and check my notes, I believe this is the first time on screen that Kong's home is referred to specifically as Skull Island. There had been references to Skull Beach or Skull Mountain in previous films, but I don't think that anyone had actually called it Skull Island until now, and that may be Peter Jackson's most lasting contribution to the overall Kong mythology. The supporting cast in this movie is strong, including Adrian Brody as the film's writer, Naomi Watts as Kong's love interest Ann Darrow, Andy Serkis as both the ship's cook Lumpy and doing the motion capture for Kong, and Kyle Chandler as dashing movie star Bruce Baxter. Chandler is also, I believe, one of the only, if not the only actors to appear in both a solo Kong movie and a solo Godzilla movie. He was also in Godzilla King of the Monsters, although this King Kong and the legendary Godzilla are not in the same universe. 2005's King Kong really feels its length because Peter Jackson spends a lot of time on Skull Island. 1 hour and 45 minutes in, when the original movie was ending, Jackson's King Kong is just getting to the epic fight between Kong and the T-Rex. And Kong arrives in New York around the 2 hour 15 minute mark when the 1976 version was wrapping up. And if I could suggest one cut to this movie, it would be the man-eating worm slugs on Skull Island. Not because they're not well done, it's actually one of the best moments in the movie, but because I've had nightmares about those things for damn near 20 years. Damn you, Peter Jackson, and your great ability to do body horror. The third act is the movie's strong suit, where it delivers on the promise to use technology to improve on the original movie. The connection between Kong and Ann Darrow is the strongest in all three tellings of the story, and you feel actual emotion as Kong slowly dies, then falls from the top of the Empire State Building. If that were the climax of a 2-hour movie, then this would be much higher up the list. But as the climax of a 3-hour movie, it instead stands out as the highlight of an uneven, overlong retelling. Also, and I know that you can't kill him because you have to keep him alive to deliver the last line of the movie,
it was beauty killed the beast.
but Jack Black's Carl Denham definitely deserved to die in this movie. His lack of comeuppance frustrates me. He is nothing but selfish and reckless and has no redemption arc, but he gets plot armor because Jackson wanted to have him still say that last line. Peter, you could have given it to anybody else. You could have had the ape say it right before he died. Listen, Andy Serkis is great. He could have pulled it off, but no, we got to keep Carl Denham around even though he is objectively the worst person in the world. Despite running wild in New York City, Kong causes relatively little damage, so I'm assigning Peter Jackson's King Kong a destruction score of just 3 out of 10, and I look forward to your fan edit suggestions on how to make the movie better. At number 16 is another of the difficult-to-find first 4 Heisei-era films. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah brings King Ghidorah back into the mix. When time-traveling aliens convince humans that future Earth will be destroyed by Godzilla, they send a team back to 1944 and prevent Godzilla's radiation exposure and mutation. This is, of course, a trick because aliens in Godzilla movies are never on the up and up. Instead, they stage King Ghidorah's mutation in order to destroy Japan and prevent its rise as a global superpower. There are a few little touches in this movie that I love. One of them is the fact that even though Godzilla is taken off of the island where he's mutated by atomic testing, he's then deposited at the bottom of the ocean where he's still exposed to radiation from a nuclear submarine accident, and it actually produces an even bigger and more powerful Godzilla. Humanity is so reckless with nuclear power that no matter where you put this dinosaur, it will eventually become Godzilla. Also, you could have given me a million guesses about things that would be included in a Godzilla movie, and I don't think even with that number of guesses that I would have gotten to Steven Spielberg origin story. And yet it's there in this movie when the time-traveling team arrives and a group of American sailors spots the UFO overhead.
Let's just keep it as our secret. You can tell your son about it when he's born, Major Spielberg. Sir, yes, sir!
I also liked one of the human stories about a Japanese soldier stationed on Godzilla's island in World War II whose life was saved when the then dinosaur helped to repel attacking American forces, which allowed the Japanese soldiers to evacuate. His respect for Godzilla is a rarity in Godzilla movies and actually adds some emotion to a somewhat silly plot. The first 2 acts would have actually dragged this movie further down the list, but I like the inventiveness of the time travel story. I liked the tie into World War II, and then things really get going in Act 3 when King Ghidorah shows up, and it's kicked off by the humans who are able to sabotage the aliens, complete with a timely Clint Eastwood reference.
Go ahead.
Make my day.
And just when you think you know how the movie's going to end, when Godzilla defeats King Ghidorah, he then continues to rampage through Japan because he is, after all, Godzilla. And Japan figures out that the only way to beat Godzilla is to go to the future and bring back Cyborg King Ghidorah. This allows the movie to have its cake and eat it too, and also gives Godzilla the rare win over King Ghidorah and loss to King Ghidorah in the same movie, bringing his record to 35, 7, and 2. The destruction here is pretty intense, spread across multiple cities in addition to the usual infrastructure and alien craft. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah gets a destruction score of 8 out of 10.
Got him! Take that, you dinosaur.
All right, let's move on to number 15 on our list. It is a Millennium-era film called Godzilla Tokyo SOS, which brings Mothra into party when the Cosmos show up to advocate for the return of Mechagodzilla's bones to the sea. We'll cover that in just a minute. Godzilla shows up before the matter can be settled, and Mothra herself is summoned to Tokyo to defeat Godzilla, but ultimately fails, dying, as is Mothra's tradition. The next generation of Mothra larvae show up to join Mechagodzilla in defeating Godzilla, and we get the rare 2-on-1 team up against the King of the Monsters. This movie has one of the franchise's longest finales. The fight scene at the end is basically half of the movie, which is entertaining if somewhat lightweight. Ultimately, Mechagodzilla turns sentient and flies both itself and Godzilla to the bottom of the ocean, where they both belong. This movie's a great one to just throw on if you don't have anything to do and you don't want to pay close attention. The worst thing I can really say about Tokyo SOS is that I actually went to see it last year at a Fathom event and completely forgot that I watched it when I was watching it for this video. When I went to Letterboxd to log it, it said I'd already watched, and I was like, oh, well, that was a mistake. No, I just saw it last year and forgot about it. You can do a lot worse than forgettable, and as you would expect in a movie called Tokyo SOS, Tokyo itself takes a beating, which cranks the destruction score up to a 6 out of 10. Due to the combined loss to both Mechagodzilla and the Mothra larvae, Godzilla comes out of the movie with a 1-2 losing record, putting him at 36, 9, and 2 all time.
Human beings made a weapon using the bones from Godzilla. That was a mistake.
Next up is a movie that's higher up this list than I'd anticipated, and it's actually why I made sure to rewatch everything, even movies that I'd already seen. It's 2019's Godzilla, King of the Monsters, and it's higher than I anticipated, largely because when it came out back in 2019, I reviewed it as a movie, whereas here I could kind of put it in context as a Godzilla movie. And in hindsight, to paraphrase Thanos, looking back on my original view, perhaps I treated King of the Monsters too harshly. It does certainly help to have more knowledge of the monsters appearing in the film, like Rodan, Mothra, and King Ghidorah. The movie doesn't really do anything to establish who they are and what their legacies are, so knowing all that stuff is a step in the right direction. The environmental messaging bothered me when I saw this movie back in 2019, not because I disagree with it, but because I felt it to be very on the nose, and Godzilla King of the Monsters was just the latest in a string of Hollywood movies with the message that mankind is the real enemy.
The mass extinction we feared has already begun, and we are the cause.
But when I see it alongside all of the other Godzilla films, it actually slots in quite nicely, even though I still think that this movie does hit it a little too on the nose. Vera Farmiga plays a scientist who invents a laptop that can talk to kaiju, which she uses to command an army to retake the planet. Kyle Chandler is her scientist husband, and Millie Bobby Brown is her daughter. But really, this is all to set the stage for some very impressively executed monster fights. Toho was allegedly reticent to license the entire character catalog to Legendary for 2014's Godzilla because of the bad experience that they'd had back in 1998. But for the sequel, they got access to everything, including the iconic Godzilla music, which appeared for the first time in the Legendary universe in this movie. One of my favorite bits of the movie is some deep insight into Ken Watanabe's character, Dr. Serizawa, who himself is named after a character in the original Godzilla movie. Dr. Serizawa's father survived the atomic bombings of Japan in 1945, which shaped the lives of both him and his son, and after offering some sage advice to Kyle Chandler,
sometimes the only way to heal our wounds is to make peace with the demons who created them.
He ends up sacrificing himself by blowing up a nuclear weapon to re-energize Godzilla and save the world. It's a surprisingly competent character arc for a movie that doesn't really do much service for its other human characters. Honestly, King of the Monsters' best attribute is that it's just really cool. The fights are cool, the monsters are cool, the action is cool. Everything else sort of falls by the wayside. I've warmed up to it a lot in the context of Godzilla's history, but not quite enough to move it into the good movie on its own 2 feet tier. I still think it is better in context as a Godzilla movie than it is as its own movie. Despite the presence of so many monsters, the only one Godzilla fights to completion on his own is King Ghidorah, with Mothra handling Rodan. Godzilla's single victory in the movie brings him to 37, 9, and 2. The destruction level here is nearly off the charts, with Antarctica and Mexico taking a hit, and Boston basically ending up a smoldering crater due to Godzilla's nuclear overload. Several other world capitals are also destroyed, but we don't see that destruction on screen. So based on what we see, I'm giving Godzilla King of the Monsters a 9 out of 10 on the destruction level meter. And with that, we now move into what I think is the top tier of this list. I believe that these final 13 films are all good movies on their own right, whether you consider them in context of Godzilla or not. And when we're talking about 45 movies, for the top 13 to all be good in their own right, I mean, that's a clearance of nearly 30%. That's better than a lot of franchises do. So let's get into these top 13 movies, and we will start with 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra. After nearly 25 years away, Mothra returns to the Godzilla franchise, taking second billing in her second Versus title matchup with Godzilla. And it turns out in this movie that Mothra isn't one of a kind. She has a darker counterpart known as Batra, who's fiercely territorial when it comes to protecting the Earth, which humanity is typically doing a very poor job of doing. And to demonstrate humanity's wastefulness as a species, we get a look at the most useless rotating platform of all time, which serves only to move 2 people closer to a monitor. You could walk around the table quicker than this. Batra unleashes his fury on the planet, prompting Godzilla to intervene, but Mothra also gets incensed when the Cosmos are kidnapped by greedy land developers. Ultimately, everybody takes their final forms, with Mothra's beauty offset by Batra's gnarliness, but in a twist, the two decide to set aside their differences and unite as a species against Godzilla. This is one of my favorite final fights in the entire Godzilla series. I love the designs of the creatures, I love the twists and turns that it takes, and while the environmental messaging is stuff that we've heard before, it's not overly trite. I'm really sad that this is one of those movies that isn't more widely available, because I think this is an essential Mothra movie. Godzilla comes close to leaving the movie winless, but as Mothra flies him and Batra out to sea, he dispatches Mothra's mate, giving him a 1-1 record just under the wire and leaving him at 38, 10, and 2 overall. Tokyo gets put through the ringer once again, with each monster taking its turn, ravaging it multiple times. It's enough to put the destruction score at 7 out of 10. At number 12 on this list is the previous film in Legendary's Monsterverse, 2021's Godzilla vs. Kong, directed by Adam Wingard. This was my first rewatch of the movie since it was released in early 2021, day and date on HBO Max, just as movie theaters were starting to reopen their doors from the pandemic, and I think it's likely that there are a lot of people that were in movie theaters for the first time after the pandemic to see Godzilla vs. Kong. I liked this movie when I first saw it, and I still enjoy it, though I acknowledge that it's not a perfect film. Godzilla vs. Kong finds Kong exiled on Skull Island to prevent his discovery by Godzilla, which would surely lead to a throwdown of alphas. Godzilla is, after all, king of the monsters, and Kong is, well, you know, King Kong, who apparently lives his life by Hobbit rules.
I know this for sure. Kong bows to no one.
With Skull Island rapidly being destroyed by storms, the decision is made to transport Kong to the Hollow Earth and his new kingdom via the slowest possible boat transport you could possibly imagine, leading to an inevitable showdown with Godzilla, after which he's just airlifted where he needs to go. On one hand, maybe they should have tried that to begin with, but on the other hand, it would have robbed us of a really cool nautical Godzilla vs. Kong round 1. The human story deals with a cybernetics company that's secretly building a Mechagodzilla, which only proves my point that you should never trust a corporation that decorates their offices like a 90s laser tag arena. Jokes aside though, I do like Adam Wingard's aesthetic. It adds a vibrance to what could have been very dull, drab, gray backdrops throughout the film. Of course, the attempt to prevent a Godzilla-Kong fight ultimately fails, otherwise this would be an egregious case of false advertising. And I actually really like the Godzilla-Kong fight, which features Kong wielding a family weapon, an axe, made from one of Godzilla's dorsal spikes that can absorb his energy. We also get a clear winner, with Godzilla subduing Kong despite his technological disadvantage. In a versus movie, especially with two characters that you like, you always run the risk that there's not going to be a clear winner, but I like that they were able to say, okay, here's what the winner is, but now we're going to move on to something different. That something different being Mechagodzilla. Kong is essentially resurrected and brought back to life to team up with Godzilla to fight Mechagodzilla. And to call Godzilla's fight with his robot counterpart a draw is generous. This clearly would have been a life-ending loss, but for the intervention of Kong. However, I'm going to be nice and not call it a full defeat, leaving Godzilla with a win against Kong and a draw against Mechagodzilla, which takes him to 39, 10, and 3 all time. The destruction level here is pretty high, as Florida's Apex Cybernetics Lab gets wrecked, as does Kong's lair, and pretty much the entirety of Hong Kong, so I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
That's a lot of fish.
Next up is the highest ranked film of the Millennium Era on my list, and the only film of that era that goes in the actually good tier, which I think by default would mean that the Millennium Era is my least favorite of the different Godzilla film eras, which, looking back on it, is pretty fair. The film is 2002's Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. Continuity is wiped yet again, and Godzilla appears in Japan for only the second time, but humanity is prepared with their new weapon, Mechagodzilla, built around, as briefly mentioned before, the original Godzilla's skeleton using biomechanics. This version of Mechagodzilla has my second favorite tech solution to beat Godzilla, behind the black hole gun, and it's called the Absolute Zero Gun, a freeze weapon meant to, well, freeze Godzilla forever. There are actually two Godzillas in this movie. There's the Kaiju Godzilla, and then there's the baseball player Hideki Matsui, who was also nicknamed Godzilla and would go on to play for the Yankees the following year. I missed the name on the back of his uniform the first time I was watching the movie because I was taking notes, and I found it so weird that we cut to a random baseball team where the coach just hits a baseball while Godzilla's approaching. As it turns out, rewinding and research are two R's that are very useful when you're prepping your ranking videos. This isn't just my favorite Millennium Era film, it's also my favorite Godzilla design of the Millennium Era, which I think most successfully blends the effort to make him look more menacing with the more classical look that we've come to expect. I also love how the practical Mechagodzilla looks in this movie, and overall, I think this is the right blend of cheesy and fun. It's serious, but not too serious for what they're going for, and at 88 minutes, it's shorter and feels way less bloated than a lot of the other contemporary films in that era. Ironically, given that I love the fight between Godzilla and Mechagodzilla, there's no clear winner, as Mechagodzilla is damaged but not destroyed, and Godzilla simply retreats. That's another one in the draw column for Godzilla, bringing him to 39, 10, and 4 all time. Tokyo once again takes it on the chin, not only from Godzilla, but also from Mechagodzilla, who at one point goes rogue and rampages through the city as well. That's just insult to injury. This ups the destruction score for the movie to an 8 out of 10.
Hey! Come here!
All right, we're now up to the top 10 movies in Godzilla Kong history, and we're starting with a movie in the Showa era. It's 1971's Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Environmental messages are as frequent in Godzilla movies as nuclear ones, and one of the first ones came in this movie, which even opens James Bond style with a custom song about pollution. Despite some of the goofier pop culture touches though, this is closer to Godzilla's roots than a lot of the Showa era films got. Godzilla's now been recast as a protector of the earth, which is now threatened by Hedorah, a monster born of water pollution that gets stronger as things grow more polluted and gains strength by sucking down smoke from factory chimneys. Listen, I said it was a message, I didn't say it was very subtle. Hedorah is of course a direct threat to the population, as all Godzilla monsters are. However, this is one of the only movies that shows us that on an individual level. Usually it's just masses of people running away. Here we see people buried in toxic sludge and being instantly turned into skeletons. This is some really scary stuff, and Hedorah also poses a real threat to Godzilla, a threat so big that he's forced to learn a new skill, taking flight with his atomic breath for the very first time. Godzilla does ultimately win the day, leaving the humans with a real get your shit together look before waving goodbye to a little kid who's his biggest fan. Usually Godzilla movies have to choose between having some sort of serious message or having Godzilla be the hero. In this movie, you get both, and I really like the ingenuity behind a lot of the fights and the designs in the film. Godzilla's win over Hedorah is his 40th all time, standing at 40, 10, and 4. A lot of the damage, though, happens off screen, though it still rates a destruction level of 5 out of 10. At number 9 is another ecologically focused film. It's a Heisei-era film called Godzilla vs. Biollante, a direct sequel to The Return of Godzilla, which jumps ahead 5 years after the Tokyo attack, with the city rebuilt to include things like the Godzilla Memorial Lounge, a building that includes Godzilla's footprint as the skylight. I love little touches like that. Godzilla's scales or cells are being used to develop a new weapon against him that would also inhibit all nuclear activity and rob him of his power. This technology also has the side effect of rendering all nuclear weapons obsolete, which makes it a power sought after by foreign governments. Knowing that Godzilla lies inside the volcano we saw him go into at the end of The Return of Godzilla, the US basically blackmails Japan into handing over the technology under threat of unleashing him on the country yet again. And while Japan does their best to avoid this, Godzilla is eventually unleashed just in time to face a new foe when an experimental plant given self-reproducing Godzilla cells to make it immortal escapes. Godzilla faces an enemy made largely of himself, which is a pretty formidable matchup. The creature is called Biollante, and it also possesses the soul of the creator's dead daughter. Long story. I love the design of Biollante in this movie, a gothically beautiful, super smart plant in the tradition of Little Shop of Horrors' Audrey 2 that can attack with vines and organic green goo. And as if this wasn't enough to deal with, Godzilla is also trying to fight off the bacteria that's been injected inside of him to inhibit his nuclear activity and basically power him down. It all comes down to a final steamy showdown against Biollante's final form, which ultimately wears him down until he succumbs to the bacteria and collapses, therefore abandoning the fight. So this goes down as a defeat in my book, taking Godzilla to 40, 11, and 4. A lot of Godzilla movies, especially as time goes on, get overly formulaic, but this one is one that I think has a lot of innovation to it, and if it wasn't for a corporate espionage side plot that I think is a little laborious, this would be higher up on my list. Osaka takes the brunt of the destruction in Godzilla vs. Biollante, racking up a score of 6 out of 10.
Erika.
Well, I may have ruffled some feathers by ranking Peter Jackson's King Kong as low as I did, so why not continue the trend and perhaps ruffle some more by ranking the original King Kong lower than many people would? I'm ranking 1933's original King Kong at number 8. I know it may be controversial to have the movie this low, but in looking at this, I have to weigh importance versus enjoyment, influence versus entertainment. And while I have an immense amount of respect for this movie and what they were able to achieve given the time that it was made, I also have to acknowledge the fact that it is at times not that entertaining. It's undeniable that this is one of cinema's most enduring stories, and what the stop motion artists were able to do in their time with King Kong is absolutely mind-blowing, which moves it up the list. But the fact that Kong's first appearance in the movie doesn't happen until 45 minutes in means that a lot of the entertainment value is put on the first half of the film, which doesn't really grab my attention.
You never had a woman in any of your other pictures. Why do you want one in this? Holy mackerel, do you think I want to haul a woman around? Then why?
Really, the most famous part of the movie, which is Kong in New York, is only the last 16 minutes of a 1 hour and 45-minute movie. There's an ongoing discussion that happens as every movie classic ages about its spot in the canon and how important influence should be, and I don't think that Kong should ever be erased from the history books or lessened in the history books for what it was able to achieve in its time and the influence that it had on future filmmakers, including people like Peter Jackson. But I think the classics that endure, the ones that really translate from generation to generation, are the ones that are able to still wield their influence but maintain their entertainment value. And I think that King Kong is perhaps moving a little bit more towards being a museum piece. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. It should be appreciated and preserved forever, but I don't think that means you have to acknowledge it as a really immensely entertaining movie forever. Now, that's not to say that it's not an enjoyable movie. It is, and that's why it's up here at number 8. If I really didn't like the movie, it'd be even lower, but I think that a lot of people might put it maybe in the top 5 because, well, you know, it's King Kong. It is King Kong, and the original Godzilla, obviously by default, is higher up this list than the original King Kong is, but I think that there's so many different factors that you have to weigh, so I tip my cap to King Kong, to Marion Cooper, to the technicians who did what they were able to do, and I respectfully place it at number 8. Not surprisingly, given the limitations to animating Kong, the destruction level in the original movie is very low, rating just a 2 out of 10.
I guess I love you.
Why, Jack, you hate women.
Yeah, I know.
At number 7 is the final film of the Heisei era. It's Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, and this era went out on a high note with my personal favorite film of the era, a movie showing heavy inspiration from 80s action films in general and Aliens in particular. Maybe that's one reason why I love it so much. Godzilla reemerges as a bigger threat than usual when his anatomy begins to destabilize and his internal temperature rises, threatening to cause a meltdown that could breach the Earth's core or turn him into a nuclear bomb with a magnitude worse than any atomic weapon, and the potential to set the atmosphere on fire with a probability much higher than near zero. And really, just visually, it's a cool and scary design for Godzilla that sets it apart from other films. As scientists try to reverse engineer the original movie's oxygen destroyer technology, a microbe from the seabed escapes and begins to grow and multiply, turning into a swarm of murderous monsters that are far more creepy than they are cheesy. The Destoroyah creatures, as they're called, even have a little xenomorph mouth that pops out alien style. With the military unable to use conventional weapons against Godzilla for fear of detonating him, they decide to bait him into a fight with the super boss version of these mutated bugs, now called Destroyer. And as bait, the always useless, except in this case, baby Godzilla, is used to lure his dad to Tokyo for the big fight. I love Destroyer as a villain, and I love that it's actually a menacing villain, going so far as to basically kill baby Godzilla, a line that I honestly didn't think the movies would cross. His offspring's death fuels a murderous rage in Godzilla, though he isn't quite able to land the final blow on Destroyer. The humans are able to dispatch the monster, while Godzilla actually melts down and, well, dies. But just when it seems like Tokyo has been rendered uninhabitable by the radiation left by Godzilla's meltdown, it is absorbed by the dead baby Godzilla, who is reborn as a new Godzilla, a death and rebirth that seems appropriate for the literal end of an era. I actually love the direction that this movie takes and the fact that it's able to give you a sense of finality in these movies, and any film in this series that can actually make me feel something for baby Godzilla deserves its spot on this list. Godzilla does go out winless, producing what I categorize as a draw with Destroyer. That brings him to 40, 11, and 5 all time. Had his radiation not been absorbed to birth a new Godzilla, the destruction level would also be much higher, but given the standard scale of the destruction on screen, I'm giving this movie a destruction score of 6 out of 10. Before I watched all these movies, I probably would have predicted that this next one would be in my top 5 because I like it so much, but that just speaks to the strength of the other movies that are actually in the top 5. Number 6 on my list is 2014's Godzilla, directed by Gareth Edwards, the first film in Legendary's MonsterVerse. 10 years ago, we finally got a decent non-Toho Godzilla film, an American Godzilla worthy of that cinematic legacy. I loved it 10 years ago, and I love it today. The most consistent complaint I've heard about this movie is that it focuses too much on the humans and that they aren't that interesting. The focusing on the humans thing, you could throw at really any Godzilla movie. I've never really found the characters to be as boring as a lot of other people do. Not that Aaron Taylor Johnson's character is the most interesting person I've ever seen in a movie, but I was invested in whether or not he was going to make it. I think the root cause for a lot of people's dislike is the early death of Bryan Cranston. This Godzilla was released at the height of Cranston mania.
My wife died here. Something killed my wife.
And I think a lot of people went in thinking he was going to like eat a radioactive pellet and then grow to the size of a kaiju and fight Godzilla one-on-one as Heisenberg from Breaking Bad. That's not obviously what happened. I'm much more upset by the fact that Aaron Taylor Johnson and Elizabeth Olsen were cast as a married couple in this movie and then siblings 1 year later in Avengers Age of Ultron. That was an adjustment to make as a moviegoer. Overall, though, I just really love this take on Godzilla. The fact that he is nature incarnate, the way for the Earth to heal all wounds and defeat all enemies. And given that Legendary wasn't able to tap into the back catalog, I also like the Mutos, radiation-sucking Starship Trooper-style bugs that terrorize the planet, until Godzilla steps in. Gareth Edwards does a lot of things really well, and one of those things is scale. I can't think of another Godzilla movie that does scale as well as this one, that captures the awesomeness of his size and presence. He doesn't need to be in every frame because that presence carries so much weight. I even love the design, less lithe and more of an unstoppable bruiser. To be in direct proximity to this Godzilla is to be in danger, and you feel that in this movie. The movie climaxes with a showdown in San Francisco that unleashes Godzilla's full power and destruction. If you can think of a better Godzilla kaiju kill than his finishing move of vomiting atomic breath down the Muto's throat, I'm all ears. There are so many great moments and sequences like the halo jump into San Francisco and Godzilla's arrival in Hawaii that make this movie great. It may not be to everybody's liking, but I just love the Godzilla that we get here, which makes sense given that it is my highest ranking Legendary film so far. Godzilla picks up 2 career wins against the Mutos, driving him to 42-11-5 overall. I'm also rating this a maximum as far as destruction goes, as we see a power plant get obliterated, military equipment destroyed, a tsunami in Hawaii, most of Honolulu gone, Las Vegas wrecked, San Francisco absolutely wrecked. It gets a 10 out of 10 for sheer size, scale, and scope of destruction.
Let them fight.
At number 5 is the 9th Showa era film, and one of my favorites that's also almost completely different tonally than the movie that we just talked about. It's Destroy All Monsters from 1968, set at the then distant end of the 20th century. Destroy All Monsters finds many of the Godzilla gang peacefully coexisting on Monster Island, including Godzilla, Rodan, Anguirus, and Mothra, all kept in check by countermeasures that keep them from leaving. But the scientists were so worried about thinking about whether they could contain all these monsters that they didn't stop to think if they should. And when the control systems are sabotaged, the monsters escape and begin wreaking havoc around the world. As it turns out, this is all the work of, and you're not going to believe this, aliens who are looking to wipe out humanity and build a better world. To be fair, this wasn't a common occurrence at the time, and as often happens when things don't quite go their way, the aliens end up summoning King Ghidorah to do their bidding, and once these monsters start fighting each other, this is like the Avengers of kaiju movies, as each monster brings a special skill to the table, minus, of course, baby Godzilla, who is, as always, useless. Eventually, the monsters get Ghidorah on the ground so that Godzilla can stomp him like Robert De Niro stomping Billy Bats in Goodfellas, and Godzilla exposes the alien's lair by literally kicking a hole in it. This movie's just a lot of fun. It has cheesy 60s elements, but it's not too cheesy. The boss battle is great. There's some genuinely impressive model work. I really just had a blast watching Destroy All Monsters. I really don't know what else you could ask for, and given that this is the highest ranking multi-kaiju movie on the list, it's also fitting that it features almost all of the Godzilla All-Stars. Godzilla picks up the W against King Ghidorah to go to 43-11-5. The destruction is also pretty intense, including on-screen takedowns of the Arc de Triomphe, UN building, the Concorde, buildings around Tokyo, and the alien island base. I'm giving it an 8 out of 10, which probably would have been a 10 out of 10 if technology had allowed the filmmakers to show all the destruction that's described. At number 4 on my list is the highest ranking Legendary movie on the list, and I'm also surprised that it's this high, but rewatching it, I just had a really good time. It's Kong Skull Island from 2017. I did not expect this to be my highest rated Kong film or Legendary film, but doing a rewatch after a number of years highlighted a lot of things that I'd forgotten, mainly that this is just a really good, stylish adventure movie that also finally fully realizes the potential of Kong as both a character and a giant monster. The scene where the helicopters arrive and we see Kong against the sun is an awesome moment, and he's supported by a really talented and likable cast. Sarah Haley Finn is a casting all-star. She was the casting director for the MCU, but also the casting director for the Monsterverse, so I guess it's no surprise that there are MCU overlaps in this movie like Samuel L. Jackson, Tom Hiddleston, and Brie Larson. Throw in John Goodman, Corey Hawkins, Shea Wiggum, and Toby Kebbell, and we've really got a stew going. And then, to really add that final spice, we have John C. Reilly as a World War II pilot that's been marooned on Skull Island for decades and has gone more than a little crazy.
The Iwis won't speak their name, but I call them skull crawlers. Why? Because it sounds neat.
I also love the idea of making this a Vietnam period piece set almost entirely on Skull Island. We're introduced to Kong as the king of his domain, not squashed into the human world. Plus, we get practically every Vietnam-era needle drop imaginable. There's also some great creature design that leads to some pretty gruesome deaths, capped off by the skull crawlers, who work on different scales that make them formidable opponents for both humans and Kong. And come on, the final fight that ends with Kong wielding a boat propeller on a chain, you can't get better than that. Kong Skull Island is just a really solid adventure movie that also works as a great introduction to the character of Kong and breaks him out of some patterns that he'd been locked into for decades. I'm putting it above 2014's Godzilla because I think it delivers slightly more on the character's potential and delivers slightly more as far as the supporting cast goes. There is a lot of action in the movie, but because that action takes place on Skull Island, the carnage is fairly minimal. I'm giving it a 2 out of 10 for the sheer number of helicopters that Kong destroys.
The world is bigger than this.
Bitch, please!
At number 3 is a relatively recent Godzilla movie and one of my new favorites. It came out in 2016 and it's called Shin Godzilla. After a 12-year layoff following Godzilla Final Wars, Toho's film series returned with one of the best Godzilla movies ever made. Fresh off the 2011 earthquake and resulting tsunami and nuclear plant disaster, Godzilla's presence as a natural disaster in this movie is more relevant than ever before. And we also get to see an in-depth look at the government's response to Godzilla, which previously mostly consisted of deciding when to deploy either the military or the latest anti-Godzilla superweapon. Shin Godzilla takes place in a Japan that's never even seen Godzilla, so when he literally slithers onto land and immediately starts causing destruction, we see the paralysis about what to do, what information to share, and how to deal with a rapidly escalating crisis. I love disaster movies, big monster movies, and procedurals, and Shin Godzilla is great at being all three of those things. No wonder I like it so much. We follow a government task force trying to figure out what Godzilla is and how to destroy him, and the third act is given a ticking clock as the world decides that Godzilla must be nuked before causing worldwide destruction, and Japan is faced for the third time with an atomic bomb being dropped on their country. Bureaucracy itself is definitely a villain in the movie, but Godzilla is pure menace, and I love the design here. There's no personality or intent. He's just a glowing, sneering, unstoppable, unthinking, uncaring, destructive force who is a radioactive threat to everyone in Japan. Shin Godzilla does everything right, from the menace of Godzilla to the social commentary, to acknowledging Japan's past tragedies, to providing real emotion, especially when it seems like an atomic bomb is going to be dropped on Tokyo. And the plan to defeat Godzilla is well thought out and executed. It actually makes sense, and it all culminates in a pledge to rebuild Japan while Godzilla literally looms over Tokyo, frozen with a nuclear strike threat still looming should he ever reawaken. Shin Godzilla is a great movie and one that sees him take a loss to humanity, which brings his overall record to 43, 12, and 5 all time. The destruction in this movie comes early and often and is centered in Tokyo, but nearly the entire city is wiped out, so I'm giving it a destruction score of 9 out of 10. Well, there are only 2 movies left, and in second place, I'm going with what I think is by default the most influential Godzilla movie of all time, but also almost the best, and that is 1954's original Godzilla, which, unlike 1933's King Kong, is one of the originals that I think still holds the same power and awe 70 years after its release. While the effects may not pass modern muster, it's the meaning behind them and the palpable tragedy that you can feel in this movie just 9 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that gets this movie up to the number 2 spot. Japan was still obviously recovering from nuclear warfare, the only country to ever experience experience it firsthand when Godzilla was invented as a walking, roaring metaphor for the sins of humanity, the horrors of atomic energy, and the danger that it still posed. There's no camp or joy in seeing Godzilla tear his way through Tokyo, and we see how this affects real civilians, the families that are broken, even the kids that are exposed to Godzilla's radiation that may be alive now but won't survive much longer. The weapon invented to defeat Godzilla is called the Oxygen Destroyer, and I love that even its use in this movie is heavily debated as its inventor, Dr. Serizawa, fears becoming a new J. Robert Oppenheimer, a scientist inventing a terrible weapon in order to solve a current problem that could then be used by others in the future for even worse purposes. Casting Japan in the role that the US had played just a few years earlier in World War II is also an interesting way to turn the situation and perhaps provoke some thought on the Japanese audience's part about what their country may have done had they been in the US's position. Godzilla is eventually defeated in a sign that a franchise was far from the filmmakers' minds, with the vague threat of more Godzillas in the future should testing continue, a threat that of course would become a reality. Generally, Godzilla 54 is dated, but in a way that shows the age of the techniques, not the movie itself. It's very rooted in a post-trauma mindset and cautionary about an uncertain atomic future from the only country that had truly borne the consequences so far. While the American version featuring Raymond Burr as a reporter who's just out of frame in all the shots that we see in the Japanese version keeps a lot of what works, the Japanese original is the one to watch. Godzilla loses to humanity once again, which brings his record to 43, 13, and 5. And yet again, nearly all of Tokyo is destroyed, which ups the destruction level of the movie to a 9 out of 10. And that brings us to number 1 on the list, which if you've been scratching off movies as we go, well, it's really an anticlimax for you. But if you haven't been keeping track, then you may perhaps think that I'm suffering from a little bit of recency bias, which is always a danger. And I gave this a lot of thought, especially because I wasn't able to rewatch this movie because it's out of theaters and not currently available on streaming or physical media. But I'm still comfortable ranking at number 1 on my list last year's Godzilla -1, which I think is not only a great film, but combines what I love about so many of the other movies. First of all, it does everything that I love about the 1954 original. It channels Japan's tragedy at a time when that wound was very recent. It also has an ominous warning about the future and shows us a Japan where its citizens, those most affected by the recent bombings, take control of their country's destiny when the government fails to act. Those are all themes and elements of the film that I think are very strong and enhance the monster action that's already there. We also have the World War II origins of Godzilla as a dinosaur on an island. This is something that's similar to the plotline I was talking about before with the businessman who saw Godzilla in World War II, although it's used a little bit differently here. Our main character, Shikishima, is riddled with guilt, not only for not attacking Godzilla when he showed up as a dinosaur and ended up killing many of his fellow soldiers, but also for not completing his own kamikaze mission. So we have a main character that we care about, something that a lot of other Godzilla films have been attacked for not having. And we get a lot of the planning that I loved in Shin Godzilla as our heroes devise a way to defeat Godzilla and rid the world of this monster once and for all. And on top of that, we get what I think are the best ever visual effects in a Toho film from the Oscar-winning effects artists who portray Godzilla once again as a genuinely terrifying monster, less mindless than what we see in Shin Godzilla, but more outwardly vengeful, which was maybe even more terrifying. There are so many great shots or sequences, including Godzilla's rampage on land and his Jaws-like confrontation at sea, that are some of my favorite Godzilla moments ever put to film. When you combine all of these elements, Godzilla -1 works almost as a greatest hits compilation of what has worked in previous movies, and it's further proof that you can tell a story based on well-worn themes or things that have been covered in other movies and still make it feel fresh and original. It says a lot that almost 70 years after this character was first introduced, Japan turned out the best Godzilla movie yet. And while we don't know what's next for either Godzilla or Kong, either in Japan or here in the US, what we currently have is a collection of movies featuring both of them, some not so great, most of them pretty good, and some really awesome that we can return to anytime we want. And looking at that entire collection, yes, I am proclaiming Godzilla -1 the king of the monsters and the best Godzilla and Kong movie ever made. To wrap things up, Godzilla loses to humanity in Godzilla Minus One, bringing his final record to 43, 14, and 5. Including draws, this gives him a lifetime winning percentage of 73.39%. Not too shabby given the stiff competition he almost always faces. Also, as far as destruction goes for Godzilla Minus One, it's again fairly contained, but also devastating as far as scope and scale. So I'm giving it a 9 out of 10, subject to review when I'm able to have a second viewing. And that wraps it up. 45 different movies featuring Godzilla, King Kong, or both. What do you think? Do your personal thoughts align with mine? Are your rankings completely different? Let me know down in the comments below, and thank you for joining me for this feature-length video in its own right. I'm always here doing box office, movie reviews. I'm going to try doing some more of these long lead projects because I really, really enjoy doing them. They're very time-consuming, but also very rewarding, and I hope that you enjoyed going over this Godzilla Kong history. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.